can't do it yet. So we're going to talk a little bit about learning briefs today. Learning briefs is a tool that I came across the first time when I worked with the DG Murray Trust a couple of years ago. They had a very interesting approach as a donor. They said for at least one of the narrative reports that the grantees are supposed to submit, they could rather do a learning brief if they chose. And the idea was to try to come up with innovations. A lot of their grantees are doing similar work, but they're doing some really interesting work, and they wanted to come up with examples of innovations. So they had a whole process set up, and they collected them. They had a knowledge management team that then edited them down, and then they posted them on their website. They called the Hands-On Learning Brief series. So there's a whole repository of those available. So that's the first time that I came across the idea of a learning brief. Learning briefs I've used in my own work to help the evaluation teams or the project teams that I work with to reflect on learning, and then just to document a couple of key points that we can then share with other people. What I find though is that the process of developing the learning brief is as useful to the organization that's doing the learning briefs as potentially the people who can go out and read them. So, you know, learning briefs, definitely the process of creating them already has benefits, and hopefully then sharing them with other people also has benefits. So I think the idea of learning briefs fits well with evaluators' roles as knowledge brokers. And I think it's just something that we can talk a little bit about. Yesterday I had a conversation with somebody, and I said, I think a good learning brief is like a movie trailer. It's like it takes 2 minutes to watch, and it needs to get you excited enough and interested enough to go, oh, I should pay attention. Because a short learning brief probably has a lot of information, but if it's got a link to another website, to another resource, to a person that you can contact, that's always helpful. So let's learn a little bit today about how to construct these learning brief trailers for our evaluations or our projects that we can share with other people. All right, Teresa.
Thank you for that, Benita. Thank you for giving us the background for why learning briefs are important and why this is something that organizations here would find, what they'd find useful about it. And with that, I'm going to invite our panelists. Our first panelist is Melissa Musselson. Melissa is a knowledge manager and editor at JET Education Services. So Melissa is responsible for JET publications, from conceptualization to dissemination. And she's been with JET since 1996, so has seen how JET's approach to publications has evolved over time. So Melissa, please take the floor and share with us your experience with JET making learning briefs.
Thanks, Teresa. It's actually Maureen.
Oh, it's Maureen.
Yeah, Melissa is from Zenex, Melissa King.
Sorry about that.
It's Maureen Musselson.
I'm sorry, I still can't share my screen. The presentations, I would like to show everybody the presentations. I'm going to try to get hold of Kate to get the screen sharing to happen. But in the meantime, maybe just start the conversation. Tell us a little bit about how you decided to do learning briefs.
Okay, so, oops, sorry, I've just lost you all. So at JET, we started doing learning briefs because we were way back when, as I say, I started at JET in 1996. And at that stage, we were doing a lot of large-scale school improvement projects. And as we were doing them, we were learning as we were going along. And we wanted to share those learnings with other project implementers because we felt, you know, we'd struggled to learn some of those things. So it was very valuable if we could start sharing them and prevent people duplicating work, enable people to learn from our experience and things like that. So our very first learning briefs were sort of summaries really of our approaches. And in the presentation, I gave a link to one of our very early ones. Benita's screen is coming up now, which was on the systemic school improvement model that we developed. If you go to that learning brief, you will see it's a description really of what we were doing. Benita spoke about the DG Murray Trust learning briefs. Jet did some of that work. I think we did 2 or 3 learning briefs for the DG Murray Trust. But since then, we've actually changed our approach to doing learning briefs. It's become much more graphic than our briefs have become much more graphic than they used to be. One of the problems that I think we were faced with when producing learning briefs was time. After being involved in a huge research report or an M&E project, and having got the report out and met the deadlines, etc., time to actually sit down and write a learning brief for a wider audience than for the technical report was always hard to find. But recently, as I say, we've moved over to doing these learning briefs using graphics. We started off using infographics. And when we wanted to develop an infographic, our publisher would always say to me, but this isn't an infographic. An infographic is meant to have figures in it. And we were using them in a different way. We were including figures where they were relevant, but we were also including snippets of text. In fact, that was more our focus. And then linking them together with the graphics. And it's really worked well for us. It might be a little bit different from the traditional view of what a learning brief is, but we're finding now that we're able to produce them very quickly. And when the report has just been finished is the best time to do it, because the person who wrote the report can then quickly highlight the main points and bring out the lessons from either the evaluation or the piece of research that was done, and put it into the format for the infographic. So now it's almost becoming something that we do on a regular basis. At the end of a long report, we'll have an infographic produced. I see on the screen there's one of the infographics from our researchers boot camp, which we ran at the beginning. We started at the beginning of lockdown, and we had 12 themes, sorry, that looked at the effects of COVID-19 on various aspects relating to education. Theme 1 is education at home, which, as it says, studied the educational experiences, etc. This is a very good example of an infographic because it lays out, I think, the whole project in a very succinct way. It gives you the theme, it gives you the purpose, it gives you very basically the research team and the approach, and the findings and the recommendations. And your findings and your recommendations for me are the main aspects of the learning brief. The other thing, so to speak about how we develop the brief, as I've said, the author will do this immediately after the report has been completed. Then often the text will need editing because you have to compress it all into a very brief format. And we work very closely with our designer. We're fortunate to have a good graphic designer, and she's able to engage with us on what it is we want to get across. And she created a whole lot of templates for us for that particular project, which we then populated for each of the themes. The advantages of, one of the advantages of doing learning briefs in this infographic format is that it's very easy to then disseminate it on websites and via social media, and we do this quite widely. So yeah, I think that's about all I have to say about how we've begun to approach disseminating the learnings from our work, which is a little bit, as I say, different from the traditional learning brief, but we have found it is a good solution to overcome the problems that we were experiencing in getting them done. Thank you. If anyone has any comments, questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you for that, Maureen. And yes, if anyone's got any comments or questions, please put them in the group chat and we'll address them in the Q&A. But thanks for sharing that, Maureen. I think I found it interesting how your process has evolved over time and how you've learned and made the learning brief something that works for you and something that you can use to disseminate your findings and things that you've learned in your organization in a succinct manner. The infographic, I think, is a really good approach. So now we'll move on to our next panelist, who is Fatima Adam. Fatima is from the Zenex Foundation, and she is the program director responsible for research and evaluations. She provides specialist input into all program and project evaluations commissioned by the Zenex Foundation and develops the organization's research strategy and agenda. She also manages Zenex Foundation's research grants. Fatima is also responsible for the foundation's communication strategy and positioning the organization as a thought leader. Fatima, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'm not responsible for the foundation's communication. No. I think that was sort of an error, or it was something that used to be, but nevertheless, thank you. So I'm trying to answer the 4 questions that Benita wanted me to do, and to do that succinctly. So the first is, why learning briefs? Now, Zenex, we like to call ourselves an evidence-based grant maker, and so we produce, in a sense, a range of research and evaluation reports that emanate from our project work. Our project work. And over time, we've done pretty well at doing the research and evaluation parts of our program, but we didn't do enough of the sharing. So we decided that we needed to improve ways of sharing these reports in digestible ways, because these reports are 100 pages and sometimes 50 pages long, and it's not possible to have them shared in digestible ways. We also wanted to consolidate learnings across different projects and different reports. So we have 4 different literacy projects, and they're telling us slightly different things, but we know that we can do some kind of meta-analysis and consolidate the learnings across. And we believed that the learning brief sort of idea provided an opportunity for us to achieve this consolidation and sharing purpose. And then how our topics are defined or identified. Well, it's a very simple, clear answer. We have a strategy as Zenex, and all our topics then must align with that. We have research and evaluation outputs every year, and so the area of focus of the learning brief must sort of align with that. And then last but not least, we must begin to focus on the burning issues, the wider burning issues, and we must time our work and our learning briefs with those burning issues. So last year, there was a lot of talk last year and sort of probably towards the end of the year before around coaching and coaching in education. And so we then, it was timely for us to take what we learned around coaching and put it together in a learning brief. The third question would be how our briefs developed. In most instances, we commission independent writers to do this for us. We have done some internally. It takes very, very long. It's an extensive process. And so more often than not, we contract independent writers to do the work for us. The way in which we do it is we sort of organize a Zenex expert on the topic with our communications and management, knowledge management and communications team, and we conceptualize the learning brief. So the purpose, the audience, the key messages, the platforms, etc. Then the independent writer is briefed. Then there's a whole process of writing that goes on between the team and the writer. And then finally it goes for production, layout, and then sort of fine-tuned into different forms, like, for example, graphic representations, etc. Right? Different summaries depending on the platform. And then the final one is how do we ensure that the use and uptake? Now that's a very, very difficult question. And I think what we'll start with by saying is that we want to be clear upfront about the target audiences and then develop tailor-made products to suit the different audiences. So if it's an academic audience, it's a different kind of product. And if it's a set of teachers, it's a different kind of product. And we make it very clear that what we're producing must be directly related to the interests of those particular audiences. And then once we've done that, we're very deliberate about the suitability of the content, the audience, and the platform. And we make sure that those three areas are done in tandem with each other, so that the content, the audience, and the platform are not misaligned. And then finally, on tracking use, I must admit it's something that's very difficult, and it's something we are still struggling with. So we've made a lot of progress on developing the learning briefs and thinking about ways in improving the ways in which they are designed, so that they can be used better. But we haven't been able to fully track use. And our team, and Tabi can speak to this because she is in the room with us, our team does online tracking, and we also do focus groups. But I think we need to become more clever, I guess, nuanced and sophisticated, really, about the ways in which we can begin to track the use of the different pieces so we know what works best. And then the final thing that I was supposed to sort of put together is sort of suggest one trap or trick. And I just went for a trap, and the one for me is don't overproduce learning briefs and don't overproduce volume, because people are busy and they have thousands of things to read, and it's not really helpful. So rather assess what's out there and make sure that whatever you're producing makes a meaningful addition. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you for your presentation, and again, sharing your organization's approach to developing learning briefs. I like the use of the word digestible there, because I think a lot of organizations are doing good work and struggling with how this is accessible, and making a product or making something that's digestible and that's tailor-made to different audiences, I think is a good way to start to see how we can reach different audiences with the information based on what we're doing in organizations. So our next panelist is Melissa King, the correct Melissa this time. Melissa is at Bridge Innovation and Learning Organization. She is the knowledge manager, and she has extensive experience in education in both research and learning design capacities. At Bridge, Melissa's focus is on developing and producing learning briefs and knowledge products for different constituents, and her core skill is in organizing and distilling information for different purposes and audiences. Welcome, Melissa.
Melissa, I think you might be muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Let me start again. So I'm going to try and build on what people have said. And I think everyone's got the idea that learning briefs are not long research reports or meeting records or research documents, but that they are short, easy to read, accessible, quick resources that could lead you to delve deeper, but that do package information in a very accessible way. For Bridge, they could be thought pieces, they could be lessons learned from different projects or programs, they could cover methodologies or useful tools, or even trends in areas such as ICTs and education. All those things are topics of interest that can be packaged in an accessible way. At Bridge, we call them knowledge products rather than learning briefs. And they are often outputs from our Bridge communities of practice. We run communities of practice across different education areas, and people come together there to share knowledge and information and their experiences. And so very often, some of these outputs are packaged into user-friendly resources. For us, I think the main aim of a knowledge product is to help people to learn from each other so that they don't duplicate, and to provide useful resources. So basically, that's why we do them. We do them as knowledge products, as outputs from our communities of practice to share information. As far as identifying the topics go, very often they are generated by the communities of practice themselves. So for example, a COP discussion, a debate of quite a few years back on what is quality in ECD led to a learning brief, which was about concepts of quality. And that in turn led to an actual set of resources, which is a practitioner quality reflection tool. Another way in which topics get identified is we find that a lot of cross-cutting themes might come up. So the example that I'm giving here is the topic of mentoring and mentorship models came up across a whole lot of different communities of practice. They came up in the teacher development COPs, the school leadership ones, the ECD ones, and even mentorship in a learner support context. So we put all the debates and the models and everything that had been shared into one resource and pulled it together in terms of including things like steps to develop and implement mentoring programs, the do's and don'ts, the kinds of roles and responsibilities, everything that had been shared, I think over about 3 years worth of meetings around mentorship and mentoring models in different contexts, because the debates had been so rich. And then the knowledge product itself had links to further information, either to actually videos shared or presentations shared by the people in the COPs. So I think one of the really useful things about a knowledge product is that you can actually have links and things sitting behind a knowledge product that takes you to further information. So those are the ways in which we've generated the topics. Yeah, I see Benita's trying to show you the cover, but maybe people can go to it later, Benita, because it's not the most visually exciting one. It's just a very content-rich one, which will bring me, I'll come back to that point about visualization in a minute. So how are the briefs developed? Basically, Bridge has a knowledge management team, and we work on the topics. Sometimes we pull in community of practice members to help us, but we are the writers, as it were. The first point to bear in mind, and I think Fatima was talking to this, know your target audience. You've got to know what the intended purpose and who the intended reader is, and craft your knowledge product accordingly. So an academic audience, there might be a slightly different approach than, say, for example, for an ECD practitioner. We talk about the use of plain English. There is a whole plain English movement, but I won't go into that now. And we also like to use visuals and graphics. And again, as I think both Maureen and Fatima have suggested, this has been a learning curve. If you go back a few years, learning briefs or knowledge products were actually quite text heavy. And I think we've all had to move quite quickly and learn quite a lot about visuals and graphics and so on. So we use tools such as Canva for simple knowledge products, but we also work with graphic designers for more complex ones. And it is a very important relationship. So knowledge products are sometimes shared with COP members. We have an iterative process sometimes, and we get feedback from them and we can refine them. Encouraging and tracking use, yes, well, I think Fatima said it all, it's very difficult. We disseminate through our website, social media, Facebook, and very often print, so that we distribute them at our communities of practice. We have used surveys, and we do track our analytics, and we try and get anecdotal feedback on whether they were useful or not. But all our knowledge products are open education resources, so basically you kind of send them out into the ether, and people can do with them what they will. So it is quite hard to track them, but we try and just gather information where we can. The tips and traps, I think I might have got a little bit carried away here because I could have gone on forever with this. Bridge is all about collaboration, so we do try and collaborate on our knowledge products as well, and we either do it through teams or group conceptualization. We have sometimes conceptualized some of the knowledge products with maybe subcommittees or small teams from the communities of practice, or we work as a team within Bridge. So I've had some experience of team writing. So while I would like to say team or group conceptualization is very productive, team writing is not. It's very challenging. You might be able to have iterative processes with teams, but you need a lead writer who actually crafts and shapes it, and don't get a whole lot of people to try and write different sections. Doesn't work in my experience. The next 2 points there are connected. Understand and get good at data visualization. I'm getting there. The example I gave you of the mentorship brief does have visuals in it, but they're quite, how can I say, dated looking. We've come a long way since then. But you need to have a good relationship with a graphic designer. Remember that graphic designers are not interested in the content. They're not going to shape it and design it and make the links with it. That's not part of their job. So you have to brief them very carefully. Another important tip, if you can, pilot or at least share your learning brief or your knowledge product before printing or disseminating it, getting a bit of feedback there. Don't underestimate the time it takes. I think Fatima also made this point. It is very time consuming because you're not just distilling, you're not just kind of accessing the original content, but you're distilling it and reshaping it for your audience. And you want to actually put it in a way that communicates effectively. And if you're trying to have some kind of visual or interesting layout, it also takes time. Proofread and proofread and proofread again, and have a budget. People seem to think you can do this, I don't know, that it just happens, but it is time consuming, and time also costs money. Yeah, so I think that's my overview, and I think that all three of us have actually connected on some very similar issues there. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution, Melissa. I thought it was very interesting that you make a distinction between simple ones that organizations can create on their own using a tool such as Canva, and then the need for, using a graphic designer, because I imagine there's some organizations who don't necessarily have the budget. So it's nice to know that, you can start somewhere. So with that, and thank you to all the panelists who've shared their experiences with us. Now I'm going to invite some questions. I know there's some questions that are trickling in from the chat already, but if anyone's got any other questions, please feel free to drop them in there so we can address them to the panelists to share more about their thoughts. I'm going to give that a little bit of a minute. I'm seeing a question there from Jet Education Services. And the question is, I'm interested to know how people search for and access learning briefs. which are being developed by various organizations for different audiences. Are there any repositories that you know of? And I think anyone can take that question. Maybe Fatima, if you have some insight into that.
So I suppose the way I understand it is that different organizations have these knowledge pieces on their own websites. So you may search a topic or an area and it could come up. You'll see something from Bridge and something from us and something from somewhere else. Alternatively, you search through the particular organizations that you believe may have something on the subject. So for example, if I think DG Murray, I think the early childhood stuff, you know, the whole nutrition, the whole, so you kind of have to then think about the association between the organization and the expert area. But having said that, there are a few repositories underway. I know that Trilog has developed, or is in the process of developing, one or two around a few key topical areas. One is on M&E, and we sort of partnering with them. And another, I think it's on literacy or something. So yeah, I think that the problem with one central sort of repository for all these things is that it's impossible to manage and maintain and update and, you know, all of that. So it sits within organizations, but it's for organizations to name those pieces of work, those products well enough so that you can pick it up if you search on the internet.
If I can just add there, Tikweza, Bridge's website is organized via our focus groups so that there is at least a topic lead. So for example, we have ECD, teacher development, M&E. In other words, the focus groups for which we have communities of practice. So that's a starting place. If you've got a particular interest area, you can at least drill down into one focus area and you'll find learning brief. You'll find lots of stuff, but you'll find some learning briefs and knowledge products in there as well.
Thank you, Melissa. We've got another question from Shadrach Mbata. And being a YEE, I think I'm a bit biased towards this question and would like to invite Shadrach to ask you his question. So Shadrach, please could you ask your question?
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Shadrach Mbata from GPME. Thank you very much for the presentations. I think they were very on point, very brief, and very crisp. And my question is around the issue of developing these learning briefs. And my question is, how can we ensure the involvement of young and emerging evaluators or researchers in the development process of such outputs while promoting ownership and advocacy? And my second question, it is with regard to the issue of sector awareness, that how can learning briefs be used as a promotional tool for sector awareness that would promote and enlighten or bring learnings in terms of policy direction for various sectors or departments to avoid future duplication of work, because of the intention is to actually submit new learnings from maybe a bulk or a huge report and disseminate it into a very brief, readable piece, a learning brief. So how can we, you know, do such, and in terms of making sure that a learning brief are used? You know, in tracking, I know the question of tracking is very difficult to answer, but you know, a policy brief might be out to direct on a various burning issue of a particular sector. But how can we therefore make awareness of such actors so that it may try to influence decision making of that sector or policy direction of that sector?
Can I say something about the second question?
Sure, please go ahead. Yeah.
I think the answer to that, and I don't think that JET certainly isn't doing it, although we would like to be doing it, is targeted dissemination. We have a CRM system, a database, or a mailing list system, if you'd like to call it that, which we use. And we often will disseminate a knowledge product by means of that database. And the thing that we do is we categorize everybody who is in our database according to their sectors, their interests, their role, government, non-government. And when we want to send something out, we'll select the categories very carefully. And I think in that way, you can almost make sure that your knowledge products are getting to the audience that they were written for, and especially to policymakers and government departments. So that is the ideal approach. It is very time consuming to maintain such a database. It does require a lot of work and a lot of man hours, which we don't always have, but that is really what we aim to do. Thank you. Does that answer the question?
Yes, no, I got that. I think I got that. You really made it very clear in terms of targeted dissemination. So basically you would know your target group when producing one. But in the case where it is high level findings and high level issues, burning issues countrywide, which really could, but also to avoid, duplication, that a study of this nature has been done on this sector, but not in terms of use, then in terms of making sure that there's awareness that there's this knowledge product in our knowledge hub, so that whenever they carry out other workers, the other research, they don't start from scratch, and they start from where the policy brief has ended moving forward.
So I suppose, can I just sort of respond a little bit to some of that? I mean, I think on the policy brief, so if you believe that you can influence policy, then you need to write something in a particular way for the policy makers, if you like. And then there's a whole process of taking those briefs to these decision makers. So it means having workshops with them, but having one-on-one, say, with the DG, it means setting up an entire influence plan, a plan of influence, so that you can get this seen and heard in different places. You might present it at a parliamentary portfolio committee. So that would be, so the document itself then has to be thought in different ways, and you've got to find a very, let's call it an aggressive approach to meet and work with a range of these decision makers at different levels. And that means you really have to think about your intention and drive that intention with that process around policy.
Could I add something sort of from the other way around, as it were, if we're talking about influencing policy? One of the things that happened in the ECD sector was that the ECD sector is very active in influencing policy and trying to participate in policy debates, and there are various kinds of civil society and governmental joint committees and so on and so forth. But one of the things that became obvious is that a lot of people were not all that familiar with all the different ECD policies. So one of the things that Bridge did at one point was to bring together the various policies into one place, like a knowledge product, and offer summaries of them. So we did a kind of a summary overview of the National Integrated Policy as a kind of a service to the sector, so that the sector can access all the policies, so that the sector can then actually try and influence the policy direction and policy change. So it's a sort of looking at it from the other way around, as it were. So instead of trying to directly influence the policymakers, you try and help the field by making policy more accessible, so that the field can then influence the policymakers. So that's another way of using learning briefs for policy change from a different kind of point of view, starting point.
Thank you for your answers and great questions that are coming through. I'm going to invite Benita to make a quick comment, And we're going to put a pause on some of the questions so we can move on to the next session, which I think will address some of the suggestions that have been coming through. But Bernice, please could you come on and make your comment?
I think it's been a very useful conversation. I think the questions that the participants are asking about, how do we find them? How do we make sure that we can develop them quickly? How do we use this knowledge to inform the policy? I think those are very good questions. And I think our role as evaluators, evaluation consultants, evaluators sitting in NGOs, and whoever else is interested in the evaluation conversation actually have a role to play. As an evaluator, I must admit, I've never actually done a Google on learning briefs for XYZ when I had to evaluate a program, which maybe would have made sense. I wouldn't have looked for a learning brief, I would have looked for other resources, but I think the idea of finding learning briefs and sharing them is quite important. In general, we are now in a time of COVID, and people need to move quickly, they need to change quickly, and they're learning at the speed of light. So I think particularly now is really important for us to make the processes shorter. It is great. I mean, all of the people said so far, it takes really long, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort to make a learning brief happen, but it does not need to be that way. On the Samia blog, we actually started posting a couple of blog posts. Let me just show you one. Here is a blog post about coaching in the early grade reading study. Now, as an evaluator, I've noticed a lot of my clients are now trying to pivot to online. And I said, I know Lorraine and her team have done some really interesting stuff using WhatsApp to coach teachers. So I said, please, 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 would you write something? It took her all of one afternoon. And she wrote this little blog post about that. It says, this is how they approach it, the virtual coaching. This is the lessons around virtual coaching. So while you want to have something properly done, in some instances, you can still have something properly done in a very short period of time. And I think we do need to think about how we do that in the COVID space, where we do need to learn quite quickly. So I think there's just a challenge for us. But I'm going to leave it there. I think it's a useful conversation, and we can continue it afterwards on the TIG listserv as well.
Thank you very much for that, Benita, and thank you to the panelists for taking the questions and for people for asking questions. We've still got questions in the chat, so if the panelists want to respond to some of the questions as we go, please feel free to. But now I'm going to move over to, or hand over rather, to Jennifer Biscard, who's going to facilitate the next bit of the session around how we can engage with the EduCOVID topical interest group. So Jennifer, please could you take over? Thank you.
Okay. I'm the Mentimeter lady. So we're going to start with doing a little bit of Mentimeter. So get a bit of feedback from everybody about which learning brief tip did you find most useful? The ones from Jet, the ones from Zenex, the ones from Bridge. For those of you who know how to use Mentimeter, you go to menti.com and you put in the code at the top. So let's go ahead and do that. So you go onto your browser, you do menti.com, and then you put in the code. Okay, the code is 428872. Can everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear
Yes,
you.
we can.
Okay.
Jen, I submitted my response, Leticia here, but it's not showing up on the screen, so I'm wondering if you need to refresh it later.
Okay, let me try that. I was wondering why I wasn't getting any response.
I have also submitted a response.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Let's try this again. Why is it not sharing?
Sometimes you have to stop sharing your screen and then share it again for us to see what you're saying.
Okay, I've stopped sharing my screen. I'm going to share again. Is that working, Leticia?
I haven't tried again. Let's see.
Oh, this is very irritating.
This is Eleanor from Jet. I also submitted. It just shows that we're waiting for the next slide from the presenter.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's very odd.
Something happened now.
Okay.
Oh, but it
Now
moved to the next slide.
Yeah, I've moved to the next slide to see if that would work. Maybe it's not sharing everybody, so everybody can see it. What I'll do is, so just type your answers and let's see if we can get going. And then we'll at least have your data. Okay, so people can do that. And then I'll share this. And then how useful was this session? We want to move on to the next one.
So I think if you move too quickly, then we can't finish typing our answers.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Well, and maybe while we've got a little bit of time,
Yeah,
perhaps it would make sense for participants to just give us a quick reflection in the chat function. I see we've got a little bit of difficulty with Mentimeter, but let's go back to the chat function. I'll try to share that from my side, and let's get some comments. What did you find interesting and valuable of this? And do you think we can take the idea of learning briefs further?
So basically just giving another 2 minutes for people to reflect on the questions. I know Mentimeter has kind of tanked on us. It's okay, it happens, this is technology and this is what happens sometimes, but I'm sure we can continue to reflect on those questions in the group chat. So I'll give a little bit of time for that.
Perhaps also after the meeting, if I can invite anybody, if they've got some interesting learning briefs that they think might be relevant to other people, given where we are at the moment now, with the kind of work that needs to happen right now, please do share that with me. We've got the Samia blog, the TIG blog, and I try to find content to post on there once a week or so. And it would be really great. We'd be happy to reblog if there's a learning brief that's already existing elsewhere. Happy to reblog that. If anybody wants to embark on developing a new one, that would be great. Just let me know, send the links to me. And we can take it from there. We've got the EduCOVID TIG listserv, which you definitely need to join. So we'll get some conversation going there. And keep your eye on the blog. We will start sharing more information as they come through. Letitia says, she said she likes seeing the different approaches that the different organizations use. Heather says, she says the aspect of widely sharing and making learning briefs more accessible beyond certain projects or organizations is also important for knowledge sharing. I think that's totally true. Jet Education Services, someone says perhaps learning briefs could be accepted or shared via SMEA platform. So that's exactly what we are proposing. And I think, yes, we are looking for M&E specific briefs, but also as M&E people, we now need to give guidance to the organizations that we work with. And if you know of an evaluation that was done elsewhere that people can learn from, that is the kind of knowledge broker job that you as an evaluator have. So yes, if you want to, we might be writing a learning brief about learning briefs. You might want to write about how do we do M&E of a project that needs to deliver PPE. That might be very interesting. But I think the challenge would be anything that we think is relevant to the education sector response to the COVID pandemic. That's in the scope of our TIG. So any suggestions around that way, send it to me. I will get it up on the blog. Laurent says she thinks exploring the potential of learning briefs using findings from evaluation, but also using these for internal reflection is important. Cara said she enjoyed the diversity of products with a common theme of digestible content. I think, again, just to build on that, you can have it as complicated as you want. You can have it as simple as you want. And you can have a one-page learning brief and a 50-page, knowledge product. But that will probably not be read as much. So yes, definitely, there's different ways with going there. We definitely need to explore that a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I suppose, Benita? Hello?
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Sorry, I was cut off, so I'm not really sure where the conversation went. But I wanted to say, one of the things we do, so often when we get new terminologies and ideas, then it becomes the new thing on the block. So then it's policy brief, then it's learning brief, then it's, some other thing. And I suppose the issue for me was whether we should even get hung up about those things or just understand that it's about sharing knowledge, evidence, research across different communities and in different ways using different platforms. So that, because I understand that it needs this kind of definition, because I just saw on one of your chats was what is the difference between a learning brief and a policy brief? And I was, on the one hand, I think it's good to try and figure out what we understand commonly by it, but on another, I didn't want to get fixated with the terminologies.
Right, I think that is an important point. I had a conversation with some evaluators from the DPME in the week, and we spoke about that in government, typically the knowledge product output from an evaluation is a policy brief, so that it can inform a policymaker. So again, I think you're right, Fatima, it doesn't matter what we call it, but it's about packaging the information to people that we think might be able to do something about it. But the idea of sharing, I think, is important. And as an evaluation community, we need to engage with that. I don't know, Maureen, do you want to make a final comment?
I just put a comment in the chat relating to the terminology, and I really like Bridget's use of the word knowledge product. I think that encapsulates a lot of what we've been saying. I mean, a knowledge product is something that conveys knowledge and that is out there that you can share. And I agree, the use of learning brief, I think it might exclude a lot of things that are actually learning briefs. And then you do have this difference between policy briefs and learning briefs. I think policy are quite an old-fashioned way of looking at it. So I think if we approach everything looking at them as knowledge products, and then perhaps define them more rigorously depending on the audience they're intended for.
Right, that makes sense. Melissa, any last comments from yourself?
Yeah, no, I'm beginning to think I've turned into Melissa Mosselson, because I also just put a comment in the chat about terminology. Because, yeah, it gets a bit tricky, but if we were going to consider what are different types of learning briefs for, it is quite nice to have some boundaries around different types and some kind of common terminology to talk about them, in which to talk about them. because there are different kinds of communications. So while I totally agree with the point that the sharing aspect is what is key, I think that maybe a little bit of a map to ways of communicating and what we're communicating for might be quite a useful thing to do. And for you M&E professionals, it may be that you also want a sort of a typology of knowledge products for M&E communications. So those are the thoughts going through my mind.
What I'm hearing is we need a learning brief on learning briefs. So if anybody feels like joining me and developing a learning brief on learning briefs, I am going to invite you to do so. Maybe let me just hand it back to Quiza. Just from my side, thank you for everybody's participation. I think it's been useful to get this engagement. And our next meeting is towards the end of July, but Quiza will tell you more about that.
Yes, thank you to the panelists for your insightful but brief presentations. I think like a lot of people have said already in the chat, it was good to understand the different products people are using, the different ways you're disseminating the information based on the programs and the work you're doing. And thank you also to the participants for participating. The discussion was rich, albeit short, but we can continue this conversation offline. And with that, I'd like to encourage you to join the EduCOVID TIG. I've put in the group chat the way in which you can join that, but this listserv kind of keeps you in the loop of what's going on and allows you to take this conversation further. Again, I'd also want to reiterate that the next meeting is on the 23rd of July. Same platform, and if you're on the listserv, when you join the listserv, you'll get further information about that. And the last bit of housekeeping is that there's an advanced Excel webinar that Samia is hosting, and this is on the 27th of July. But thank you, everyone. Please look at the group chat to see how you can join the EduCOVID listserv, and that's all from me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.